There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, like a Tuesday night or a simple question. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in through the quietest of doors, a draft of cold air you only notice when the fine hairs on your arms stand up. And by the time you realize the climate of your entire world has changed, the moment has already passed into memory. It becomes a photograph you can only develop in retrospect, turning it over and over in the darkroom of your mind until the image finally resolves, sharp and clear, revealing the before and the after. For me, that moment was the first time Caleb asked if he could stay. Not just on the couch, where he had collapsed in a heap of exhaustion and quiet desperation for weeks, but in the actual, breathable space of my life, in the room that had for so long been a fortress for my own carefully guarded heart. He was a silhouette against the pale blue light of the television, a shape I had memorized better than any constellation. His shoulders were slumped, the powerful lines of his swimmer's frame softened by a weariness that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. The movie we weren't watching played on, its synthetic score a thin blanket over the dense, humming silence that had become our primary language. He had been quiet for almost an hour, a stillness so profound it was its own kind of noise, a low frequency I felt in my teeth. I was pretending to read, the same page for the last 20 minutes, the words dissolving into meaningless patterns on the paper. My entire consciousness was focused on the 2 feet of space between my end of the sofa and his, a gulf that felt both impossibly wide and dangerously narrow. Then, he shifted, the leather of the couch groaning in protest, and the sound of his voice, rough with disuse, cut through the air. "Leo?" I didn't look up immediately. I held onto the fiction of my book for a few more seconds, a flimsy shield against the gravitational pull of his gaze. I knew, without seeing, that he would be looking at me with that lost expression he'd been wearing ever since Sarah left, a look that stripped away all the layers of easy confidence he wore like a second skin and left him looking like a boy who had been told the world wasn't the place he thought it was. "Yeah," I finally answered, my own voice steadier than I felt. He hesitated. I could hear the slight, wet sound of him worrying his lower lip, a nervous habit he'd had since we were 18. "The couch is killing my back." It wasn't a complaint so much as a statement of fact, delivered with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire city. I waited. This was the rhythm of our new dynamic, this strange, delicate dance of unspoken need and tentative offer. He would present a problem, a small crack in his composure, and I would wait for him to let me see how to fix it. I was the quiet observer, the patient cartographer of his sorrow, and I knew that to rush him would be to spook him back into the wilderness of his own pride. Would it be weird?" he started, then stopped, the words catching in his throat. He cleared it, a small, rough sound. "My room's a disaster. I haven't really been in there properly." And there it was, the real truth, hiding behind the pretext of a sore back. His bedroom, the one he had shared with her, was a museum of a life that had suddenly ended, and he couldn't bear to sleep among the ghosts. My apartment had become his sanctuary, a neutral space where the past had no claim on him. I finally closed my book, placing it carefully on the coffee table. I turned to face him, really face him, and the exhaustion on his features was so profound it was like a physical blow. Dark circles smudged beneath his eyes, and his usually vibrant, ocean blue eyes were clouded over, distant. "You can take my bed, Caleb," I said softly. "I can take the couch. It's no problem." He shook his head, a quick, dismissive gesture. "No, I couldn't. That's not." He trailed off again, his gaze dropping to the floor between his feet. The silence stretched, and I felt a familiar ache bloom in my chest, a dull, chronic pain I had learned to live with years ago. It was the ache of wanting to give someone everything and being allowed to offer them only the smallest, most practical kindnesses. Then he looked up, and his eyes met mine, and in their depths, I saw something new. Not just exhaustion, not just sadness, but a raw, terrifying vulnerability. It was a plea. I don't want to be alone," he whispered. The words were so quiet I almost wasn't sure I'd heard them, but they landed in the space between us with the force of a tectonic shift. "Would it be okay if I just stayed? In your room? The floor? Or whatever?" My heart did a slow, painful lurch against my ribs. The floor. He was asking for the floor, like a stray seeking shelter from a storm. And I knew in that instant that I was standing on a precipice. I could maintain the boundary, offer him the couch again, keep the carefully constructed walls of our friendship intact. Or I could open the door. Just a crack. I could let him in, knowing full well I might never be able to close it again, knowing it might ruin everything. "Don't be an idiot, Caleb," I said, and the words came out gentler than I intended. "The bed is big enough." A flicker of something, relief, maybe, or something more complex, passed across his face. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And that was it. No more words were needed. That was the moment the season changed, the quiet, unassuming Tuesday night when a simple question became the foundation for everything that was to come. It was the beginning of the ritual, the long, slow, agonizing process of learning the shape of his sleep, the sound of his breathing in the dark, and the unbearable, exquisite torture of lying next to the one person in the world I wanted to hold and pretending it meant nothing at all. Our story, the real one, had begun 8 years earlier, in the chlorine-scented cathedral of a university swimming pool. I was a freshman, scrawny and quiet, a photographer who swam because the solitude of the water felt like the inside of my own head. It was a place of muffled sounds and distorted light, a world where the only thing that mattered was the rhythm of your own body, the burn in your lungs, the long, silent glide after the turn. I was good, but I was an artist first, a swimmer second. My observations were always from the periphery, my focus on the way the afternoon light shattered on the surface of the water, the abstract patterns of ripples, the exhausted, beautiful humanity of my teammates after a punishing set. Caleb was the sun around which our small planetary system of a team revolved. He was the captain, a junior with a backstroke that was pure, fluid power. He was loud. He was funny. He was effortlessly charismatic, and everyone, from the coach to the quietest diver, loved him. He moved through the world with an uncomplicated confidence that I found both fascinating and intimidating. He was everything I wasn't. Where I was quiet, he was a roar. Where I observed, he participated. Where I saw the world in shades of gray and subtle light, he seemed to see it in bold, primary colors. For the first few months, our interactions were limited to the functional camaraderie of the team. A good set, Leo tossed over his shoulder, a clap on the back after a close relay, the shared exhaustion of morning practice. I watched him from a distance, the way an astronomer watches a distant star, cataloging his light, his energy, his gravitational pull on others. I photographed him, of course. It was impossible not to. He was a study in kinetics, all sharp angles, an explosive force in the water, and relaxed, easy grace out of it. I have a whole series of black and white prints from that first year, hidden away in a box, titled simply Caleb, Caleb laughing with his head thrown back. Caleb with his goggles pushed up on his forehead, listening intently to the coach, droplets of water clinging to his eyelashes like tiny crystals. Caleb, exhausted, sitting on the edge of the pool deck, his broad shoulders hunched as he stared into the water, for once looking as solitary as I felt. It was in that moment of solitude that our friendship truly began. It was after a particularly brutal mid-season practice. Everyone else had cleared out, rushing to the dining hall or the library. I was packing up my camera gear, my fingers clumsy with fatigue. He was still there, sitting on the bleachers, not moving. He hadn't even showered. He just sat there, wrapped in a towel, dripping onto the concrete floor. The vast, empty natatorium was silent except for the gentle lapping of the water against the gutters and the hum of the ventilation system. The air was thick with the smell of chlorine and damp concrete, a smell that for me would forever be linked to him. I almost left. My natural inclination was to respect the privacy of his quiet moment, to slip away unnoticed, as I always did. But something held me back. The slump of his shoulders, the way his head was bowed. It was a posture of defeat I had never seen on him before. It made him look less like the Golden Team captain and more like someone who was carrying something heavy. I walked over, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "You okay?" I asked, my voice sounding small. He looked up, and his eyes were red-rimmed. It was such a shock that I physically recoiled a step. He tried to manufacture a smile, but it was a broken, flimsy thing. "Yeah, just long day." I knew it was more than that. I could see it. I sat down on the bleacher below him, leaving a respectful distance. I didn't push. I just sat there with him in the echoing silence, my camera bag a heavy weight on my lap. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, two figures in the deepening twilight of the empty pool, the water turning from bright blue to a dark, inscrutable navy. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and raw. "My mom." The test came back. He didn't have to say more. He just let the words hang in the air between us, and I understood. I didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. I didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," before there was even a loss to be sorry for. I just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. And I stayed. I stayed until he was ready to get up, until the silence had done its work and given him back some small measure of strength. As we walked toward the locker rooms, he put a hand on my shoulder, a brief, firm pressure. "Thanks, Leo," he said, and his voice was thick with an emotion I couldn't name. For not saying anything. That was the beginning. After that, the distance between us collapsed. It turned out that the loud, confident captain needed a quiet place to land, and for some reason, he chose me. He started seeking me out, not just at the pool, but in the dining hall, at the library. He learned about my photography, poring over my prints with a genuine, unfeigned interest that made my chest feel tight. He'd point to a photo of a fractured reflection in the water and say, "How do you even see that?" I was in the same pool, and I never saw that. And I would try to explain that I didn't see things as they were, but as they felt, as arrangements of light and shadow and emotion. He would just shake his head, a look of wonder on his face. It was during those years that I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden crash, but a slow, creeping tide. It was in the way he'd save me a seat, the way he'd remember a tiny detail I'd told him weeks ago, the way his laughter seemed to physically warm the air around me. It was in the casual, unconscious touches, a hand on my arm to get my attention, a friendly shove, the way our shoulders would press together when we sat in a cramped booth. Each touch was a small, searing brand on my skin, a reminder of the impossible gulf between what our friendship was and what I desperately wished it could be. I became an expert at hiding it, a master of emotional camouflage. My quietness became my shield. I channeled all the yearning, all the aching tenderness into my art. My photographs from that period are full of him, even when he's not in the frame. They are about the space he just vacated, the light he stood in, the water he moved through. They are studies in presence and absence. I loved him with a silent, hopeless, and utterly devoted patience. He had a girlfriend, Sarah, a kind, intelligent girl from the volleyball team. They were the perfect couple, golden and beautiful and destined for a life I could only imagine from the outside. I liked her genuinely, and I learned to swallow the bitter taste of jealousy, to smile and be the supportive friend, the third wheel, the permanent resident of the platonic zone. It was a role I played so well that I sometimes convinced even myself. I told myself that his friendship was more than enough, that having him in my life in any capacity was a gift. And for years, I almost believed it. After college, we both ended up in the same city, a happy accident that felt like a reprieve. He got a high-powered job as a software consultant, traveling constantly, living a life of airports and hotels and client dinners. I found a small studio apartment and pieced together a living as a freelance photographer and part-time art handler at a gallery. Our lives were vastly different, but our friendship remained the one constant, a sturdy, reliable anchor. He was the one I called when a gallery rejected my portfolio. I was the one he called from a lonely hotel room in a city whose name he could barely remember. We were each other's fixed point, and his relationship with Sarah continued, a long, steady hum in the background of his life. I had made my peace with it. I had built a quiet, solitary life for myself, a life where my love for Caleb was a piece of antique furniture, a thing of beauty and memory, but something I no longer actively used, something I had learned to live around. I thought I had it all under control. I thought the wanting had finally faded to a dull, manageable ache. I was wrong. I had only learned how to hold my breath. The shift began, as so many seismic changes do, with a phone call in the middle of the night. It was a Tuesday, just after 2 a.m. The jarring sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand dragged me from a deep sleep. My first thought was that something had happened to my parents. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled for the phone, my eyes struggling to focus on the screen. The name displayed was Caleb. "Hello," I said, my voice thick with sleep and alarm. Silence. For a few seconds, all I could hear was a faint, staticky sound, like wind blowing over the receiver. Caleb? Are you there? She's gone. His voice was a wreck. It was hollowed out, scraped raw, a sound I had never heard from him before. It was the voice of a man who had been completely dismantled. What? Who's gone? Caleb, what's wrong? Sarah, he breathed, and the name came out as a ragged sigh. She left. She packed her things, and she's gone. I sat bolt upright in bed, suddenly wide awake. What do you mean she's gone? Where did she go? I don't know, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. She said she wasn't happy. Hasn't been for a long time. She said we were just going through the motions. A habit. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. 5 years. A habit. My mind raced, trying to find the right words, the right thing to do. All the usual scripts felt hollow and inadequate. I'm so sorry seemed insulting. It'll be okay was a lie. Where are you? I asked, my voice taking on a practical edge. It was my default setting in a crisis, the retreat into logistics. I'm outside your building. My heart squeezed. I was already out of bed, pulling on a pair of sweatpants. Stay there. I'm coming down. When I opened the heavy front door of my apartment building, the late autumn air was cold and sharp. He was sitting on the steps, his head in his hands. He was still in his work clothes, a tailored suit that was now rumpled and sad. He hadn't even taken off his tie. He looked up as I approached, and his face in the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp was a mask of pure devastation. He looked utterly, terrifyingly lost. I didn't say a word. I just sat down next to him on the cold concrete steps and waited. He started talking, the words spilling out of him in a torrent of confusion and pain. He told me about the fight, the cold, quiet finality of her words, the shock of finding her closet half empty. He talked for over an hour, circling the same points, trying to make sense of something that had no sense. I just listened, a silent, solid presence in the dark. I was the wall he could lean against, the empty vessel he could pour his grief into. It was the role I had always played. It was in the weeks that followed that the change truly took root. He couldn't stand being in his apartment, the space they had built together. It had become a monument to his failure. So he started showing up at mine. At first, it was for dinner or to watch a game, a desperate flight from the silence of his own home. He'd arrive looking drained, the ghost of his usual bright energy haunting his features. Then he started falling asleep on my couch, a deep, exhausted sleep that was more like a surrender. I'd find him there in the morning, a blanket I'd draped over him kicked to the floor, his face etched with a vulnerability he never showed the waking world. The old boundaries of our friendship, once so clearly defined, began to dissolve. The line between my space and our space blurred until it ceased to exist. My quiet, solitary apartment, my fortress, became his refuge. And with this new proximity, this constant, unshielded presence, came a new, terrifying level of awareness. I was aware of the scent of his shampoo when he used my shower, the way he left his shoes by the door, the sound of his key in the lock using the spare I had given him ages ago and which he'd never used until now. My carefully constructed peace was shattered, replaced by a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety and a hope so fierce it felt like a sickness. The locker room moment happened about a month after the breakup. It was a Thursday. He was supposed to be on a flight to Chicago, but it had been canceled. He called me from the airport, his voice frayed with frustration. Can I just come over? I can't go home. It wasn't even a question anymore. Of course, I said. He showed up an hour later. I was just back from the gym, a habit I'd picked back up, a way to burn off the nervous energy that was constantly thrumming through me. I was at my locker, changing, when he came in. He didn't say hello. He just walked straight towards me with a strange, intense look on his face. He was still holding his travel bag. The locker room was mostly empty, just the two of us and the ambient sounds of dripping showers and clanging metal doors. He stopped right in front of me, closer than necessary. I had just pulled on a clean t-shirt, and my hair was still damp. I could smell the faint, clean scent of the gym's generic soap on my skin. He was crowding me, his presence so overwhelming I felt the sudden, primal urge to take a step back, but my locker was right behind me. There was nowhere to go. Hey, I said, trying for casual. Bad day. He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his blue eyes narrowed, searching my face as if looking for a clue. He leaned in closer, his head tilting slightly. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the faint, stale scent of airplane air clinging to his clothes. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. What was he doing? He pushed me. It wasn't violent. It was a firm, deliberate pressure, one hand flat against my shoulder, pinning me lightly against the cool metal of the locker door. The soft thud echoed slightly in the quiet room. My mind went completely blank. All my senses were on high alert, focused on the point of contact, the heat of his palm through the thin cotton of my shirt. He leaned in even closer, his face just inches from mine, and he inhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. My own lungs seized. I could see the tiny flecks of gray in the blue of his irises, the faint stubble on his jaw. The world seemed to shrink to the space between our faces. Then he spoke, his voice a low, confused murmur, almost an accusation. "Why do you smell different today?" The question was so bizarre, so out of left field, that for a second I couldn't process it. "What?" I managed to choke out. "You smell different," he repeated, his gaze still locked on mine, intense and unblinking. "It's clean. Not your usual. I don't know. Your soap." It was nothing. It was everything. It wasn't about the soap. I used whatever was at the gym. It was about the fact that he knew my smell, that he had it cataloged in his brain, a baseline against which to measure a deviation. It was about the fact that his reaction to this tiny, insignificant change was to physically pin me against a wall and interrogate me with his eyes. It was a moment of profound, unnerving intimacy, a glimpse into a subconscious awareness he had of me that I never knew existed. It was a raw, unfiltered impulse, an animal instinct to investigate something that was suddenly, inexplicably, new. He seemed to realize what he was doing all at once. The intensity in his eyes flickered, replaced by a wave of confusion. He pulled his hand back as if my shoulder had burned him. He took a step back, breaking the spell, and the air rushed back into my lungs. He ran a hand through his hair, looking flustered, embarrassed. "Sorry," he mumbled, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know what that was. I'm wrecked. The flight, everything. It's fine," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But it wasn't fine. Something had been irrevocably broken in that moment. A wire had been tripped. He had crossed a line he didn't even know was there, and in doing so, he had shown me a part of himself, a part of his perception of me, that I could never unsee. It was the moment the ground beneath my feet, already unstable, crumbled completely away. The unspoken had been given a voice, not in words, but in a strange, desperate, physical question. And it was a question for which I had no answer, only a terrifying, blossoming hope. That night was the first time he asked to sleep in my bed. The excuse was a sore back from the couch, but after the incident in the locker room, I knew it was something more. It was a retreat, a flight to safety, to the one place that felt steady in his imploding world. My room. Me. And so the ritual began. It started as a practical solution to a feigned problem, but it quickly morphed into something else entirely, a nightly pilgrimage that became the new, unspoken center of our lives. The first few nights were an exercise in exquisite torture. I would lie on the very edge of my side of the queen-sized mattress, my body rigid, my muscles clenched. I feigned sleep, my breathing measured and even, while every nerve ending in my body was screamingly aware of him, of the heat his body generated, of the subtle shifts and movements he made as he settled into sleep. The bed, my bed, which had always been a solitary island, a place of quiet refuge, was now a shared territory fraught with unspoken rules and invisible borders. I built a fortress out of my pillow and the comforter, a pathetic little rampart against the magnetic pull of his presence. I would lie there in the dark, listening to the sound of his breathing as it deepened and evened out into the slow, rhythmic cadence of sleep. It was an impossibly intimate sound, a sound that felt like a secret I shouldn't be privy to. I learned the specific texture of it, the slight hitch in his breath just before he drifted off, the rare, soft snore when he was truly, deeply exhausted. It felt like I was learning the blueprint of his soul in the dark. He always slept with his back to me. It was an unspoken agreement, a concession to the platonic nature of the arrangement. He would curl up on his side, facing the wall, creating a vast, empty space in the middle of the bed, a no man's land of polite distance. And I would lie on my back, staring up at the ceiling, my hands clasped over my chest, a sentry guarding a treasure I wasn't allowed to touch. The temptation was a physical thing, a constant, dull ache in my hands. The desire to reach across that chasm of cotton sheets, to lay my palm flat against the warm, strong expanse of his back, to feel the rise and fall of his breathing under my hand. It was overwhelming. It took every ounce of my self-control not to do it. I would clench my fists until my knuckles were white, digging my nails into my palms, the small, sharp pain a grounding force against the tidal wave of my longing. My room became a dark room where the image of us was slowly, painfully developing. Each night added another layer of detail, another shade of intimacy. I memorized the way the moonlight from the window would catch the blonde tips of his hair, turning them silver. I memorized the shape of his shoulders under the thin fabric of his t-shirt. I memorized the faint, clean scent of him, a mixture of his soap and something that was just uniquely, fundamentally Caleb, a scent that now permeated my pillows, my sheets, my entire room. My life was becoming saturated with him. He never spoke of it in the morning. We would wake up, carefully avoiding eye contact, and he would mumble a thank you before retreating to the bathroom. By the time he came out, dressed and ready to face the day, the mask of the old Caleb would be partially back in place. We'd make coffee, talk about his work, my latest project, the weather, anything but the 6 or 7 hours we had just spent sharing the most intimate of spaces. The plausible deniability was a shield for both of us. For him, it allowed him to receive the comfort he so desperately needed without having to name it, without having to confront what it might mean. For me, it was a way to survive. If we didn't talk about it, then I didn't have to face the high probability that it meant nothing to him, that I was just a warm body in a storm, a convenient port. To name it would be to force a definition, and I was terrified that the definition would be just friends, so I clung to the ambiguity. The not knowing was agonizing, but it was also the only space where hope could live. The ritual evolved. After a couple of weeks, the rigid, back-to-back sleeping arrangement began to soften. One night, I woke to a strange weight and warmth against my back. I froze, my heart instantly hammering. He had rolled over in his sleep, his body pressing against mine from shoulder to knee. His arm was thrown carelessly over my waist, his hand resting on my hip. He was completely asleep, his breathing deep and steady against my neck. I lay there, rigid as a statue, every muscle screaming. I was trapped, pinned by the casual, sleeping weight of the man I loved. The contact was electric, a wildfire spreading across my skin. I could feel the heat of him seeping through my shirt, the solid presence of his body a shocking, terrifying, wonderful reality. I should have moved. I should have gently extricated myself, retreated to my side of the bed, re-established the border. It would have been the sensible, self-protective thing to do. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed by a feeling so potent it felt like a drug. It was the feeling of a prayer, whispered silently for years, being unexpectedly answered. I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, terrified that any movement would wake him and shatter the moment. I focused on the feeling of his hand on my hip, the weight of it both a comfort and a torment. I focused on the warmth of his breath on my skin. I lay there for what felt like hours, a willing captive, soaking in the accidental intimacy, branding the memory onto my soul. When the first pale light of dawn began to creep into the room, I carefully, painstakingly, slid out from under his arm and slipped out of bed, my body trembling. When he woke up, he was back on his own side, and neither of us ever mentioned it. But it happened again, and again. His unconscious body seemed to be seeking mine in the dark, a slow, gravitational pull I was powerless to resist. The no man's land in the middle of the bed disappeared. The border was erased. Soon, it became the norm for us to end up tangled together, his arm around me, or my head finding its way to his shoulder. It was a sleep-drenched intimacy, always deniable, always attributable to the pull of dreams. The nights were a secret country we inhabited, a world with its own rules and its own language of touch, a world that vanished with the morning light. During the day, I was a wreck. The constant switch between the profound, albeit unconscious, intimacy of the night and the careful, friendly distance of the day was giving me emotional whiplash. I was living a double life. I would be at the gallery, trying to focus on hanging a painting, and my mind would drift back to the feeling of his leg pressed against mine, the weight of his head on my chest. I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. The hope was becoming unmanageable, a wild, overgrown thing that was threatening to strangle my reason. I started to analyze everything, every word, every gesture. When he'd smile at me over his coffee cup, was it just a friendly smile, or was there something more in his eyes? When he'd touch my arm, was it just a casual gesture, or did his fingers linger for a fraction of a second too long? I was a detective in a mystery of my own making, searching for clues that were probably never there. I was going insane. One evening, the pretense of the ritual was almost shattered. He had come home from a particularly grueling week of travel. He was beyond exhausted, a hollowed-out version of himself. He skipped dinner and went straight to my room, collapsing onto the bed fully clothed. I came in a little later to get ready for sleep myself and found him curled on his side, shivering slightly despite the warmth of the room. He was wearing a thin shirt, and the stress of the past few months had made him lose weight. He looked smaller, more fragile than I'd ever seen him. I pulled the comforter up over him, my movements slow and careful. As I did, his eyes fluttered open. They were hazy with sleep, unfocused. He looked at me, but I wasn't sure he was really seeing me. "Leo," he murmured, his voice a sleepy rasp. "Go back to sleep," I whispered, tucking the blanket around his shoulders. He reached out, his hand clumsily finding my arm. His fingers were cold. "Don't go." My heart stopped. He was awake. He was conscious. And he was asking me not to go. "I'm not," I said, my voice tight. "I'm just getting in." I slipped into bed beside him, my body on high alert. He didn't roll away. Instead, he shifted closer, a deliberate movement, and pressed his face into my back, nuzzling against my shoulder blades like a child seeking comfort. His cold hand was still gripping my bicep. "Cold," he mumbled into my shirt. And then, I broke my own rule. The one rule I had held on to with a white-knuckled grip for all these weeks. I turned over. Slowly, deliberately, I rolled onto my other side to face him. His eyes were closed again, but I knew he wasn't fully asleep. The air between us was thick with unspoken things, charged and electric. He was so close I could feel his eyelashes flutter against my cheek. His hand had slipped from my arm and was now resting on my chest, right over my heart, which was beating a frantic, wild rhythm against his palm. I wondered if he could feel it. I wondered if he knew what his touch was doing to me. I lifted my hand, the movement feeling slow and heavy, as if moving through water. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my fingers hovering in the air just above his hair. And then I touched him. I gently brushed a stray lock of hair off his forehead. It was the first time I had ever touched him with conscious, deliberate intent. The act was terrifying and exhilarating. His skin was cool, and the strands of his hair were soft against my fingertips. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just let out a soft, contented sigh, a sound that seemed to vibrate right through his hand and into my chest. And in that moment, lying there in the dark, with his hand on my heart and my fingers in his hair, the line between friendship and something more, between comfort and desire, between his need and my love, ceased to exist. It was all just one thing. It was us. The tension that had been building for weeks, a low, constant hum beneath the surface of our lives, finally reached its breaking point on a quiet Sunday night. It had been a day of almost domestic normalcy. We'd gone for a walk in the park, bought groceries, and cooked dinner together, moving around my small kitchen in an easy, familiar rhythm. It felt so dangerously close to the life I had secretly dreamed of that it was physically painful. The whole day, I had felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the illusion to shatter. As evening fell, a soft rain began to patter against the window panes, enclosing us in our own little world. The sound was a gentle, hypnotic drumbeat against the silence that had fallen between us. We were on the couch, the same couch where this new chapter had begun, but this time we weren't at opposite ends. We were sitting close, our shoulders and thighs pressed together, sharing the warmth of a single blanket. We were watching an old black-and-white movie, something I'd put on for the atmosphere more than the plot. The flickering monochrome light cast moving shadows across Caleb's face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the soft curve of his mouth. He hadn't said more than a few words in an hour, his gaze fixed on the screen, But his stillness was different tonight. It wasn't the stillness of exhaustion or sadness. It was a charged, watchful stillness, like the air before a storm. I could feel the shift in him, a subtle change in the energy field between us. My own body was a tightly wound spring, every nerve ending hyper-aware of his proximity. The casual, constant contact that had become our norm suddenly felt deliberate, freighted with meaning. I could feel the warmth of his leg against mine, the solid pressure of his shoulder, and it was no longer just a source of comfort. It was a question. He turned his head, and I felt his gaze on me. I kept my eyes fixed on the television, my heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew if I looked at him, I would be lost. Leo. His voice was low, barely a murmur, but it cut through the sound of the movie, through the sound of the rain. It was the same way he had said my name that first night, but this time it wasn't a plea for help. It was something else, an invocation. I forced myself to turn, to meet his eyes. The blue of them was dark in the dim light, deep and unreadable as the ocean at night. He was looking at me with an intensity that made the air feel thin, hard to breathe. The easy confidence was gone, the grief was gone. In their place was a raw, naked vulnerability that mirrored my own. It was the look of someone standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified and wanting to jump. We just looked at each other for a long moment. The world seemed to fall away. The movie, the rain, the room itself. It all dissolved into a blur, and the only thing that existed was the charged space between his eyes and mine. I saw the flicker of a question in his gaze, a deep, uncertain searching. He was looking for permission, for a sign, and I knew that whatever happened next depended on me. I could look away, break the spell, retreat to the safety of our carefully constructed friendship. I could make a joke, ask him if he wanted more popcorn, and the moment would pass, and we could pretend it never happened. But I was so tired of pretending. I was tired of the ache, of the longing, of living in the gray space of ambiguity. My love for him, so long a quiet, subterranean river, was rising, threatening to break its banks. I held his gaze, and I let him see it. I let him see everything I had hidden for years. The hope, the fear, the desperate, aching tenderness. I stripped myself bare, emotionally, and laid my heart at his feet. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever done. His expression softened. The tension in his jaw eased. A flicker of understanding, of recognition, dawned in his eyes. He lifted a hand, his movements slow, hesitant, as if he were afraid I might bolt. He cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking gently along my cheekbone. His touch was electric, a spark that shot through my entire body. It wasn't an accidental, sleeping touch. It was awake. It was deliberate. It was a choice. He leaned in, and the world slowed down. I watched his eyes flutter closed. My own breath hitched in my throat. This was it. The moment I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times, 1,000 different ways, was actually happening. It was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't passionate or desperate or dramatic. It was quiet. It was tentative. It was unbelievably, achingly gentle. His lips met mine. It was the softest of contacts, a bare, questioning pressure. It wasn't a kiss of possession or demand. It was a confession. It was a surrender. It was the word please made of skin and breath. My own eyes slid shut, and I leaned into the kiss, a small, almost imperceptible movement that was my answer. It was my yes, yes, I see you. Yes, I am here. Yes, finally. A soft sigh escaped him, a sound of relief, of release, and the pressure of his mouth deepened slightly. His other hand came up to cradle the other side of my face, holding me as if I were something precious, something fragile. My own hands, which had been clenched into fists in my lap, uncurled. I lifted them and rested them on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart under my palm. It was beating just as fast as mine. We stayed like that for a timeless moment, our lips moving together in a slow, exploratory rhythm. It was a conversation without words, a dialogue of touch and breath. It was 8 years of unspoken feelings, of stolen glances and casual touches, of friendship and longing, all culminating in this one, quiet, world-altering kiss. It wasn't an end to the tension, but a transformation of it, from a painful, anxious hum into a clear, resonant chord. It was the feeling of a door, long since locked and bolted, finally swinging open. It was the feeling of coming home. I woke to the sound of silence. The rain had stopped, and the early morning light filtering through the blinds was pale and gray. The space beside me in the bed was empty. For a disorienting second, my sleep-addled brain tried to convince me that last night had been a dream, a particularly vivid and cruel fabrication of my own longing. But then I saw it. The indentation on the pillow next to mine, the rumpled sheets where his body had been, and my heart, which had been floating on a cloud of quiet euphoria, plummeted into the icy pit of my stomach. He was gone. He hadn't just gotten up to use the bathroom. His shoes were gone from their place by the door. His jacket was gone from the back of the chair. He had left. He had slipped out in the pre-dawn quiet, like a thief, without a word, without a note. The beautiful, fragile world we had built last night shattered into a million pieces. The kiss, which had felt like a promise, like a beginning, now felt like a mistake. His mistake. I was a moment of weakness, a port in a storm, a warm body to chase away the loneliness of a Sunday night. And now, in the cold light of day, he was gone, fleeing from the scene of the crime, from the complication I represented. The old, familiar ache returned, but this time it was 100 times worse, sharper and more vicious, because for a few short hours, I had allowed myself to believe it was gone for good. I spent the day in a fog of hurt and confusion. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, searching for a clue I had missed. Had I misread everything? Was it just a moment of confused grief for him, a transference of feelings that had nothing to do with me? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting knife in my gut. I checked my phone 100 times. No calls, no texts, just a gaping, damning silence. The silence stretched for 2 days. 2 days of him not showing up at my door, not calling, not answering my one, tentatively worded text. Hey, is everything okay? It was the longest 48 hours of my life. The hope that had blossomed in my chest withered and died, leaving behind a barren, desolate landscape. My apartment, which had been our shared sanctuary, felt hollow and huge, echoing with his absence. The scent of him was fading from my pillows, and I found myself irrationally terrified of it disappearing completely, as if it were the last tangible proof that any of it had been real. On the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was eating me alive. The hurt was curdling into a slow, simmering anger. Anger at him for his cowardice, and anger at myself for being so foolish, so vulnerable. I needed to hear it from him. I needed him to look me in the eye and tell me it was a mistake. I needed the finality of the rejection to cauterize the wound, to allow me to begin the long, arduous process of moving on. I went to his apartment. I stood outside the door for a full 5 minutes, my heart hammering, my hand hovering over the doorbell. This was it. I was about to deliberately detonate the last remnants of our friendship. But the alternative, living in this limbo of ghosted silence, was unbearable. I took a deep breath and rang the bell. The seconds ticked by. I heard faint movement from inside, then the sound of the chain being slid, the lock turning. The door opened a crack. He stood there, looking even worse than he had the night Sarah left. He was unshaven, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was wearing the same t-shirt he'd had on 3 days ago. He looked haunted. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He just looked weary, resigned. "Leo," he said, his voice a rough croak. "Are you going to let me in?" I asked, my voice colder and steadier than I felt. He hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider. I walked in. The apartment was a disaster. Clothes were strewn over furniture, takeout containers littered the coffee table, and a thin layer of dust covered every surface. The air was stale and heavy. It was the physical manifestation of his mental state. He didn't meet my eyes. He just stood by the door, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat. "So this is it," I began, my voice trembling slightly despite my efforts to control it. "This is how you do it? You kiss me. You let me believe, whatever the hell that was. And then you disappear? Not even a text message, Caleb? After everything? After 8 years." He flinched at the anger in my voice, but he still didn't look at me. He stared at a spot on the floor, his jaw tight. "Leo, you what?" I pressed, taking a step closer. I needed to see his face. "You're sorry? You're confused? It was a mistake? Just say it. Whatever it is, just have the decency to say it to my face." "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. A fresh wave of pain and frustration washed over me. You can't, or you won't. What the hell does that even mean? You had no problem kissing me, but you can't find the words to explain why you ran away? Was I just convenient? Was that it? A substitute until you figure out how to be alone? No. He finally looked up, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The anguish in his expression was so profound it stopped me cold. No, it wasn't that. It was never that. Then what was it? I pleaded, my anger dissolving into a raw, desperate need to understand. Help me understand, Caleb, because I am drowning here. He took a shaky breath, running a hand through his messy hair. I don't know how, he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. I don't have the words for this, Leo. I've spent my whole life on a track. You go to school, you get a job, you have a girlfriend, you get married. It's a map. It's all laid out. And you were never on the map. He gestured vaguely around the disastrous apartment. This all fell apart. Sarah leaving, it wasn't just losing her. It was losing the map. I was completely lost. And the only place, the only person that felt safe, that felt real, was you. He took a step towards me, his eyes pleading. I didn't plan for it. I didn't understand it. All I knew was that being near you was the only thing that made sense. Lying next to you at night. It was the only time my brain would shut up. It was the only peace I'd had in months. And the kiss? I asked softly, my heart aching for him, for both of us. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. The kiss wasn't a mistake, he said, his voice choked with emotion. It was the most honest thing I've done in years. And it terrified me, because it felt right. More right than anything with Sarah ever did. And that's not supposed to happen. It's not on the map. It's not who I am. He shook his head, a gesture of deep, internal conflict. It's not who I thought I was. He looked at me, his face a canvas of fear and confusion and a dawning, terrifying realization. I ran because I was scared, he whispered. I'm still scared. I look at you, and I feel something I don't know how to name. And it's so big it feels like it could swallow me whole. And I have no idea what to do with it. And there it was. Not a rejection, but a confession. A confession of fear, of confusion, but underneath it all, a confession of feeling. He hadn't run from me. He had run from himself. He had run from the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that his entire life, the entire map he had been following, was wrong. And that I, the quiet observer, the steady friend, was his actual, unexpected, uncharted destination. The conflict wasn't over, but the silence was. And in its place, we finally had the start of a painful, frightening, and beautiful truth. The truth, once spoken, did not magically fix everything. It hung in the air of his wrecked apartment, fragile and terrifying. The confrontation left us both drained, two soldiers after a long, brutal battle, surveying the wreckage. There were no easy answers, no sudden declarations of love. There was only the raw, messy honesty of his fear and my bruised, cautious hope. In the days that followed, we began the slow, painstaking work of building something new from the rubble. It was a process of tentative steps and quiet conversations. The grand, sweeping gestures of romance were not for us. Our language was one of small, incremental movements, of learning a new kind of honesty. He didn't move back into my apartment. Instead, I started helping him reclaim his own space. We spent a weekend cleaning, a silent, shared activity that was its own form of therapy. We threw out the old takeout containers, washed the mountains of clothes, and packed Sarah's remaining things into boxes with a quiet, respectful solemnity. As we worked, we talked. Not about US, not directly. We talked about his job, about a new series of photographs I was planning, about our college days. We were relearning how to be in the same room, rebuilding the foundations of our friendship before we could dare to build anything on top of it. We were creating a new map, together, one small, uncertain step at a time. He didn't sleep over, but the nights were no longer a source of anxiety. He would call, his voice soft and tired after a long day. We would talk for hours, the phone calls becoming a new kind of intimacy, a space where he could practice articulating the feelings he had never had words for. He would tell me about his day, and then he would pause, and in a lower, more hesitant voice, he would try to explain what was going on inside his head. He spoke of his fear, of the deep, ingrained societal expectations he was struggling to shed. He spoke of the confusion, of reconciling the man he thought he was supposed to be with the man he was discovering himself to be. I never pushed. I just listened, offering him the same quiet, patient space I always had. But this time, it was a space he was actively, consciously choosing to enter and be vulnerable within. About 2 weeks after the confrontation, he showed up at my door late one night. He looked tired, but it was a different kind of tired. The haunted, frantic energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled weariness. "Can I come in?" he asked. It was a real question this time, not a demand disguised as one. "Always," I said, stepping aside. He didn't collapse on the couch. He just stood in the middle of my living room, looking at me. "I don't want to sleep on your couch," he said, his voice steady. "And I don't want to pretend I'm sleeping in your bed just because I'm lonely or sad." He took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. "I want to sleep in your bed, with you, because you're you. Because I want to be next to you. If that's okay." My heart, which had been so carefully guarded for the past 2 weeks, swelled with a profound, quiet joy. The ache in my chest eased, replaced by a feeling of warmth, of peace. The pretense was gone. The plausible deniability was gone. All that was left was a simple, honest request. I didn't need words. I just reached out, took his hand, and led him toward the bedroom. That night, when we lay down, there was no awkward distance, no fortress of pillows. He turned to face me, and I turned to face him. He reached for me, and I met him halfway. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close until my head was resting on his chest, right over his heart. I could hear its strong, steady beat, a rhythm that felt like coming home. I wrapped my own arms around his waist, holding on tight. "Is this okay?" he whispered into my hair. "It's more than okay," I murmured into his shirt. "It's everything." We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. We just held each other in the quiet dark, breathing in unison. There was no torment, no anxiety, no unspoken longing. There was only a deep, profound sense of peace. The storm had passed, and we had found a safe harbor in each other. The ritual, born of desperation and denial, had been transformed into a conscious act of love and intention. The door to my room, once a symbol of a fragile boundary, was now simply the entrance to our shared space, a room where two people who had been lost finally found their way. In the end, it turns out that some of the most important moments in life are not arrivals at a predetermined destination, but the quiet, terrifying, and beautiful discovery that you have been on the wrong map all along. They are the moments you realize that home isn't a place you are heading toward, but a person you are standing beside. For years, I had loved Caleb in silence, a quiet observer of his life, a photographer capturing his light from a distance. I thought our story was one of unrequited love, a friendship that was a consolation prize. But I was wrong. Our story was a slow exposure, an image developing patiently in the dark, waiting for the right moment, the right chemistry, to finally reveal itself. It wasn't about him finding his way back to his old life. It was about him having the courage to abandon the map altogether, and about me being brave enough to be the place he landed. And as we lay there, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, I knew we were no longer just a sanctuary from a storm. We were the beginning of a whole new world.